Welcome to Lubbock ISD TV. If you're watching, you may be a member of the Future Focus Committee or a community member who's keeping up with what we're doing. We've had some questions from our last meeting at Atkins Middle School about asbestos abatement, and we are lucky to have an expert here with us to talk about that today. So Jace, thank you for coming to Lubbock ISD TV.
Absolutely.
And let's start off by just telling our viewers about you. Tell us about yourself and your experience.
Well, thank you for having me here, Erin. We've worked with LISD for a long time, and so I'm happy to help answer questions and kind of reassure anybody that may be experiencing or having involvement with this for the first time. So, yeah, my name is Jace Hassoldt. I have worked for King Consultants, and I'm one of the partners for about 17 years now. I started doing this in 2008. I have a Master's of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies, so have kind of a background in engineering and business and just kind of general science. I've been licensed with the state of Texas as an asbestos consultant since 2008. So I've got, I think, probably 8 or 9 different individual licenses, kind of in a variety of environmental backgrounds, but they're all state governed licenses, with 4 of them specifically geared towards asbestos. And so, yeah, I've worked for LISD on environmental projects probably since about 2010. So I think I've been into almost every campus at some point.
I bet.
In that time.
That's a long time.
Yes.
Well, we know, and there's a lot of information out there about it, but just from your perspective, tell us about what asbestos is and why was it commonly used in building materials and when?
Yeah, so it was really used predominantly throughout the 20th century. I would say there's not like a specific time frame, but really heavily used predominantly in most building materials throughout the better part of that century. And it was used mainly because it was a good fireproofing material. It acted as a matrix or bonding agent for when they were mixing different types of materials. So when you see joint compound on sheetrock or you see plaster, it really acted as a good binding material or agent for those types of materials. The heat resistance and the fire resistance was a big deal because they could go in and they could coat and treat materials with an asbestos material and make it last longer and make it ultimately just be more usable in most scenarios. And so it was used from everything from floor tile and mastics to fireproofing and pipe insulation, roofing, window glazing, caulking. I mean, you go down the list, if it's not wood or plastic or glass, at some point it was probably used in most materials.
Well, we know now there's some risks associated with the material. And tell us about that and when does it become hazardous?
Yeah, so it is a known carcinogen. That's why ultimately it stopped being used in production and in materials throughout the United States. It's still used in developing countries and other parts of the world, but we've really controlled its usage here. It's not a hazard when it's intact, is ultimately the key kind of component to this discussion and when we have any sort of concern with it. So when you look at any of our existing campuses that have a asbestos floor tile, when it is intact, it's not damaged, it's not being really aggressively disturbed, it poses no hazard and no threat. When you see even fireproofing, a material that's easily disturbed, but it's inaccessible, it's intact, it's not being continually disturbed and disrupted in some form, it's really going to pose little to no hazard. And ultimately, the biggest way that we kind of help the district ensure that is we have to follow federal standards that require us to go in and do assessments of those materials every 6 months, and then do a full assessment that happens district-wide every 3 years, where we're going through and we're cataloging all of those materials, addressing ones that may have started to show signs of deterioration, because if we see anything that looks like it could be a possible hazard, that's when we immediately stop and address it in some form.
So you've I had a question about this, but you kind of answered already about how we can say schools can still be safe, consider safe environments for our students and staff when it's present in the building.
Yeah, so during that 6-month walkthrough that we do every year or twice a year, and then during that 3-year assessment that we do, that's called the AHERA. It's an Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. So it was basically a program that was implemented by the federal government for all K through 12 school districts throughout the country. So it's not just a Texas specific thing. But what that means is that we go in, we catalog building materials, we do sampling, sometimes you can go in and just assume materials based on age or what they look like. But then we assess all of those and we say what their condition is, what their likelihood for becoming disturbed or deteriorating looks like. And so we're constantly going through campuses, and even if it's something as small as going into a classroom that we see some flooring that looks like it's starting to crack, it's starting to come up, it's showing signs that it's been damaged at some point in the last couple of months, then we're immediately noting that. We're getting with the district and saying, hey, here's kind of our list of stuff that we feel like needs addressed. And so that's really kind of the first step in saying we have an active program that is ensuring that these materials stay in a safe and intact condition.
Well, that leads to my next question about when abatement is necessary.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
So there's incredibly strict processes that have to be followed, both from a federal standpoint and from a state standpoint. So first off, nobody can come in and do any work in a district building or public building that is not appropriately licensed and trained. So I have my own licenses that are on the consulting and kind of the professional services side. So those are going to be geared towards those building surveys that we do, and inspections and testing and air monitoring and document design and reporting, kind of some of that side of the issue. But then all of our contractors that come in and do work for the district have their own separate set of licensing. So those are all going to be licensed workers, licensed supervisors. They're all individuals that have gone through a background of training that's all mandated and all governed by the state. And so everybody, including myself, has a continuing education course that they do every year to say, okay, here's updates to these regulations, here's what happens. So we're not just having random contractors or people just come in and do work, but when they do, they have first our specification that is a design, basically saying here's how we're going to do it and here's the steps that you have to follow. But then on a broader scale, they have their regulations that we have to stick to, that the state mandates, that says, okay, we're enclosing this area, we're putting it under negative pressure so that we're filtering and constantly pumping the air outdoors, we're keeping everything wet, we're bagging everything immediately. So there's never any scenario where they're going in and doing work that's not under a completely isolated and controlled environment. And then ultimately, before we can ever turn back over that work area to the school district, we're doing really aggressive air monitoring, showing we no longer have anything present in the air. It's safe for us to have other contractors or staff or students come back into place.
It sounds like a big process.
It is normally, yes.
So you've talked a little bit about how long you've worked with Lubbock ISD. How do you respond to parents and staff when they have concerns about, you've kind of addressed the monitoring, the annual requirements around making sure the buildings are safe, but what would you say to our parents who have kids in the building and our staff who have concerns about this?
So first off, I have a 9-year-old daughter, so she's in 4th grade. I understand fully the concerns of parents having fears or worries with this and 1,000 other things when they're sending their kids to school. So ultimately, the best thing that I can say is that from a professional standpoint, companies like ours have a lot of liability on our shoulders to make sure that we are following the right procedures and having a safe environment for students and staff. And the district also has a huge amount of responsibility when it comes to ensuring a safe building and a safe place that those students are in. Ultimately, this is a building material, or this is an ingredient to building materials that has been used for a long, long time. Every parent of a student in LISD, if they went to a public or probably a private school, if it was older than in about the last 30 years, it had asbestos material in it, whether they realized that at the time or not. Like I said, it's in most older building materials. And so it's not something that's uncommon. It's not something that's specific to individual campuses or to individual districts. If you go to any district throughout the state of Texas, there's going to be asbestos materials in their older schools. We work with or have worked with hundreds of school districts. And so ultimately, it's addressed the same way, no matter if you're a huge district like LISD or if you're a smaller school district in the Panhandle. it's all governed with the same amount of regulation and the same amount of care, because ultimately there is a huge need for trust between staff and students and parents and teachers, that ultimately what's being done is being done correctly and safely, and that the building as a whole is safe.
Well, gosh, that's a lot of really great information, a lot of myths that are out there about
Yes,
asbestos. So thank you for helping explain not just what it is, but also like how we work to keep our buildings safe for our staff and families. So Jace, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yes, ma'am. Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
Of course.